November 20th, 1943. Dawn breaks over Tarawa Atoll like a blade of light cutting through haze and salt. The sea is calm, almost deceptively so, a glassy silence stretched between two worlds about to collide. Out beyond the reef, the United States Navy prepares to unleash the heaviest naval bombardment in the history of the Pacific War. For 76 minutes, 3,000 tons of shells will fall upon a scrap of coral barely 3 miles long. From the decks of battleships and carriers, men watch as their guns open in synchronized fury. The air trembles. The horizon becomes a furnace. Great columns of smoke rise where coconut palms once stood. Every bunker, every trench, every fortified blockhouse vanishes beneath waves of fire. To the cameras on American carriers, it seems as if the island itself has ceased to exist, replaced by a single gray cloud that blots out the morning sun. The order moves down the line. Cease fire, land the Marines. Across the transports, engines roar to life. Landing craft shudder in the swells, packed with men staring into that wall of smoke. They are young, tired, and certain of victory. After what they have just witnessed, it seems impossible that anything human could still be alive on that inferno of coral. Officers reassure them, the Japanese are finished, the island is a ruin. But beneath the smoke, the truth waits. The Japanese garrison, some 4,500 strong, has dug so deep into Tarawa's coral heart that even this storm of steel cannot reach them. Their bunkers are buried, their machine guns silent only by choice. When the bombardment ends, they crawl back to their firing ports, weapons dry, nerves steady. They have survived the end of the world, and now they prepare to meet the Americans who believe they are already dead. They thought the fire had killed everything. It had only awakened what remained. In the next hour, that illusion of victory will shatter, one landing craft at a time. Beneath the shattered coral of Betio Island, silence returns. Heavy, absolute. The bombardment has ended, but the earth still trembles, a low echo in the bones of men who should no longer be alive. In these narrow tunnels, Japanese Marines of the 3rd Special Naval Landing Force crouch amid fumes and falling dust. Concrete drips with condensation, the air tastes of salt and powder. Outside, the Pacific glows red. Inside, it is the color of ash. Lieutenant Colonel Keiji Shibasaki stands at the center of this labyrinth, his uniform torn by fragments, his expression calm. A naval officer turned island commander, he had built Tarawa's defenses with a single conviction that the atoll could not be taken in 100 years. Now, in the half-light of his bunker, he whispers a short prayer to the emperor, wipes grit from his face, and orders his men to hold. Around him, hundreds of soldiers sit in perfect silence, their discipline unbroken, their faith untouched by the thunder that has buried them alive. For 2 days they had endured the shelling. Concrete shuddered, coral cracked, and the sand itself melted into glass. Radios have been torn from their wiring, air vents clogged with dust. The bombardment had severed their voice to the outside world. But within these walls, command still flows like an electric current. Hand signals replace words. Duty replaces fear. These are not ordinary infantrymen. They are Imperial Marines, the spear point of Japan's island defense, trained to kill until their bodies fail. Their creed is simple, ancient, and absolute. 1 Japanese soldier is worth 10 Americans. It is a belief born from centuries of warrior culture and refined through the fire of modern war. To them, Tarawa is not a battlefield, but a shrine, and every death a form of worship. When the shelling stops, they do not celebrate survival. They prepare for the next act. Ammunition is checked, firing slits are cleared, and rifles rest on sandbags that still radiate heat. Outside, they can hear faint engines, landing craft grinding toward the reef. In this darkness, they wait like stones at the bottom of the sea. Faith is their armor. Fire will test its strength, and above them, the tide begins to rise. The first wave leaves the safety of the transports and pushes toward Betio Island. Dozens of landing craft slice through the surf in neat formation, each carrying 30 men and their faith in the bombardment they have just witnessed. From the decks behind them, officers watch through binoculars as the horizon shimmers in heat and smoke. It looks lifeless, the aftermath of creation undone. But beneath that haze, the Pacific hides its first betrayal. The tide, misjudged by the planners, has failed to rise. Higgins' boats grind to a halt on the coral reefs, stranded hundreds of yards from shore. Engines roar and strain, propellers thrash water and sand, but the boats will not move. There is no choice. The Marines throw down the ramps and jump. The lagoon swallows them whole. Men sink to their chests, rifles lifted high, packs dragging them backward. The air erupts, a sharp, mechanical scream. From bunkers once thought destroyed, Japanese machine guns awaken, cutting the surface of the water into white spray. Bullets skip across the lagoon like stones. Dozens of Marines vanish in seconds. The others press forward, wading through blood and salt, clinging to shattered Amtraks as if they were islands. Cameras aboard the carriers record the impossible sight. Men advancing through waist-deep surf, burdened by gear and silence, while tracers weave across the sky. Officers shout for cover, but there is none. The wall of fire that was meant to clear the island now reverses its course. It is America's turn to burn. When the first survivors reach the beach, they find no solid ground, only a ridge of blasted sand and the dead who arrived before them. The Japanese are invisible, buried in concrete, their guns whispering from the shadows. The battle has lost its distance. It becomes personal, fought one body length at a time. The fire was never a weapon. It was a language, and both sides spoke it now. In the next hour, that language would consume the island's heart. Before the first American shell touched Tarawa, the island already belonged to another century. Its defenders were heirs to an ancient faith, a creed older than their rifles, deeper than the ocean that surrounded them. In the years before the war, Japan had built an army not only of men, but of spirit. Schools, temples, and barracks alike had taught a single, unbending truth: that will could triumph over matter. That purity of purpose could defeat machines. From childhood, soldiers learned words that would follow them to their graves. Duty is heavier than a mountain, death lighter than a feather. It was more than poetry. It was law. It shaped how a man fought and how he died. In a world now ruled by technology and steel, Japan's warriors believed that spirit alone could still command the outcome of battle. Theirs was a moral geometry, courage squared against comfort, devotion against doubt. Lieutenant Colonel Keiji Shibasaki was the embodiment of that creed. A career naval officer, born into privilege yet trained in austerity, he viewed Tarawa not as an assignment, but as destiny. To him, the atoll was a crucible, proof that the Empire's faith could resist America's industry. As engineers poured concrete and carved bunkers into coral, Shibasaki moved among them, reciting the promise that had already become legend. "It will take 1,000,000 men, 100 years to take Tarawa." His soldiers repeated it like scripture. Under his direction, the garrison transformed the island into a labyrinth of defiance. Over 500 bunkers, pillboxes, and trenches, each one connected through tunnels of coral and steel. Ammunition was stacked in hidden vaults. Firing ports were camouflaged to disappear into the terrain. The island's shape itself was used as a weapon. Every inch had been measured, every field of fire tested. The Americans would not find a beach, only an altar built for sacrifice. As construction finished in the autumn heat, the men of the 3rd Special Naval Landing Force gathered under the rising sun flag. They bowed, not in ceremony, but in preparation for eternity. They believed the Empire's spirit could not be broken, that discipline could defeat destiny itself. Belief without mercy can be stronger than fear, but never stronger than fire, and soon that fire would come for Tarawa. Across the Pacific, the United States arrived not as an army, but as a system, a living network of factories, formulas, and faith in production itself. By late 1943, the arsenal of democracy had reached full stride. What had begun at Pearl Harbor as humiliation had become, in less than 2 years, an empire of steel. Carriers lined the horizon. Cruisers and destroyers formed concentric rings of power, every ship a floating city, every weapon a product of the same assembly line rhythm that built cars and railroads before the war. Tarawa was to be the demonstration, a proof that industrial precision could overcome human fanaticism. On the carriers, the Marines studied aerial photographs, memorizing coordinates of bunkers, reefs, and landing zones. Everything was calculated: the tides, the angles of fire, even the timing of each assault wave. Watches were synchronized to the second. Engineers spoke not of luck or courage, but of logistics: the number of shells, the fuel ratio, the tonnage of ammunition required to erase an island. For months, American planners had refined the machine of invasion. The new amphibious tractors, LVTs, were its gears, designed to crawl over reefs where boats could not pass. Seabees followed close behind, ready to build airstrips before the smoke even cleared. Each element had its place, each movement its chart. The plan was an equation, and equations do not fail. To the Marines waiting below deck, the scale of that machinery was comforting. They trusted in its magnitude, in the belief that nothing could resist the weight of American order. They carried the quiet pride of a modern nation, a belief that precision itself was a weapon, that the organized will of millions could crush the chaos of one fanatic island. But war, as it always does, would rewrite the arithmetic. The ocean was not a factory floor, and the men who waited beneath Tarawa's coral bunkers were not variables to be solved. When the first Higgins boats ran aground on the reef, the rhythm of the machine faltered. Schedules dissolved, lines broke, and the precision of planning gave way to the disorder of blood and salt. Industrial confidence, too, is a kind of faith, and like all faiths, it must be tested. Ahead lay that test, and the Pacific would be its proving ground. From the command decks of the American fleet, Tarawa looked finished. Through the haze of smoke and distance, naval observers watched the bombardment tear the island apart. For over an hour, their guns had spoken with the confidence of empire. Thousands of shells cascading in perfect order, striking every visible point of resistance. The sea boiled, the jungle disappeared. Even hardened officers believed they had witnessed annihilation. The final reports carried 2 words, repeated again and again: complete destruction. But destruction has layers. Beneath the cratered surface of Betio, the island still breathed. The bombardment had shattered palm trees and blockhouses, yes, but not the bunkers that mattered. The Japanese had dug into the coral itself, carving shelters as deep as the roots of the island. When the storm of fire passed overhead, they crouched behind reinforced walls, sealed by steel doors and damp earth. The noise was apocalyptic, yet survivable, and in those minutes between life and death, they learned that endurance could masquerade as invincibility. When the last American shell fell silent, an eerie calm swept across the lagoon. Smoke drifted like weathered silk. The observers, high on the bridges of cruisers and battleships, nodded in satisfaction. The plan had worked. The island was neutralized. Messages flashed through the fleet, passing the illusion of victory from one command to the next. On cue, the next phase began. "Cease fire! Commence landing!" Then, beneath the settling dust, the island stirred. From shattered pillboxes and half-collapsed trenches, the Japanese garrison re-emerged. Hundreds of gunners unsealed firing ports, brushed away coral dust, and realigned their weapons. Their radios were dead, but their discipline was alive. They had survived the unimaginable, and now they believed themselves chosen. For the Marines wading toward the beaches, this truth would come too late. They advanced under the assumption of dominance, expecting silence where death waited in patience. The first bursts of automatic fire cut through that illusion like a blade through cloth. The war they thought they understood, mechanized, predictable, ordered, dissolved into something far older, more personal. The island was not conquered ground. It was a trap set beneath their own confidence. In war, every victory misjudged births its own disaster. And on the horizon, the waves still carried men who did not yet know they were walking into it. The first assault wave reached the reef just after 9 in the morning. From the decks behind them, commanders could still see the island through drifting smoke, a strip of fire and shadow 3 miles long. The sea between was shallow, calm, deceptively clear. But in that water waited the deadliest 100 yards in the Pacific. As the Higgins boats struck coral, their engines screamed and died. The tide, misread by naval intelligence, had not come in far enough. The Marines inside looked at one another. No orders, no hesitation. They jumped. Into chest-deep water they plunged, rifles above their heads, packs dragging them backward. Ahead, the island flickered with light. Japanese machine guns, silent through the bombardment, now came alive with mechanical precision. The first bursts shredded the calm. Men fell before they had taken 10 steps. In the lagoon, the water turned red, rippling outward like spilled ink. Amphibious tractors, the new LVTs built to cross the reef, burst into flame under direct hits from hidden 75mm guns. The air filled with the crack of bullets and the hiss of burning fuel. What had been a disciplined assault dissolved into survival, individuals crawling or swimming or floating wherever the fire was least intense. Some used the wreckage for cover. Others, too exposed, crouched behind the bodies of those who had gone ahead. Radios sank, maps disappeared beneath waves. The command posts offshore called for updates and received only static. For 2 hours, the chain of strategy snapped, replaced by instinct, will, and the ancient logic of the battlefield. Move forward or die where you stand. From their buried positions, Japanese gunners fired until their barrels glowed dull orange. Each time an American reached the sand, they shifted aim and cut him down. Yet the Marines kept coming. They used rifles that would not fire after the salt water, pistols clogged with grit, grenades pulled one-handed while crawling through mud. It was war reduced to its smallest element. One man against one position, courage against calculation. By midday, the lagoon was a graveyard. Burning tractors drifted with the tide, their crews gone. Entire companies had vanished between the reef and the beach. But the assault did not stop. Reinforcements came behind them, crossing the same killing ground, stepping through the same surf, and dying in the same places. Slowly, inch by inch, the living began to accumulate on the shore, scattered groups forming a line without command, without cohesion, but with the one quality the plan had not measured: endurance. When darkness fell, the firing eased. The sea reflected the glow of wreckage, a dim horizon of flame. On the beach, Marines dug shallow trenches with their helmets, using dead coral for sandbags. Behind them, the water whispered with the sounds of the wounded calling out. their voices carried by the wind toward ships that could not reach them. By nightfall, 1,500 Americans lay dead or bleeding, the cost of a single day on a single mile of sand. Yet somehow the line held. The machine had failed, but the men had not. Progress was measured not in yards, but in heartbeats, and before the sun rose again, they would need to find the strength to move once more. By the second morning, the lagoon had gone quiet. Smoke hung low over Betio, and the tide had begun to drag wreckage back toward the open sea. For a moment it seemed as if the island itself had paused to breathe. Then the silence broke, sharp cracks of rifle fire, the thunder of mortars, the hum of a war still learning how to fight itself. The Marines were no longer following a plan. The perfect geometry of invasion had collapsed on the reef. Command posts had been destroyed, radios soaked in salt, officers scattered or killed. What remained were fragments of units, squads without leaders, engineers without blueprints, adapting by instinct and necessity. Every lesson that had failed in training would now be rewritten in blood. They began to learn the shape of the enemy. The Japanese did not fight from open trenches, but from the earth itself, bunkers buried in coral, firing slits no wider than a man's palm, hidden beneath shattered palm trunks. Grenades rolled harmlessly off their walls. Rifles could not reach them. Only fire could. The engineers went first, weighted by satchel charges and flamethrowers. They crawled across open ground between explosions. One bunker at a time, they cleared the island. A blast of flame, a scream of compressed air, then silence. The kind of silence that followed only when the fire had done its work. They advanced on hands and knees, burning and blasting through concrete that the bombardment had barely scratched. The new amphibious tanks, LVTAs, joined them in the assault. Their 75mm guns pounded the interiors of fortifications at point-blank range, shells exploding with such force that entire sections of coral wall crumbled inward. For the first time, firepower and movement fused, armor that could cross water, artillery that could fight alongside men. The island's defenders had never seen machines like these, but still, they did not yield. Offshore, the Navy adapted as well. Destroyers moved dangerously close to the beach, their hulls scraping shallow reefs to bring their guns within 1,000 yards of target coordinates relayed by spotters on the sand. Each strike was now measured in yards, not miles. Naval gunfire and infantry had merged into one organism, a single mind of survival improvising under pressure. Innovation was no longer pride, it was instinct. Every mistake of the first day became a discovery by the second. Flame replaced theory, observation replaced doctrine, and the Marines, who had begun this battle as soldiers of a modern machine, now fought as craftsmen of destruction, patient, precise, methodical. Inside the bunkers, the Japanese fought to the last breath. They fired until their weapons jammed, then threw grenades until their hands were empty. When the walls closed in, they chose death over surrender. Even wounded men, unable to stand, waited with grenades clutched to their chests for the next American to pass. Their resistance was not fueled by hope, but by a conviction that death itself could still serve their emperor. By afternoon, the beaches had become laboratories of adaptation, places where courage and invention were forced into the same narrow trenches. Each breakthrough was measured in feet, each advance in seconds of survival. The human capacity to create had turned inward, finding form not in factories or doctrine, but in the immediate need to endure. Invention, like courage, is born under fire. And by dusk, that fire was spreading toward the island's heart, where one final stronghold still waited in silence. By the dawn of the second day, Lieutenant Colonel Keiji Shibasaki no longer commanded from maps or messages. The wires had been severed, the radios destroyed, and the horizon that once shimmered with the rising sun now pulsed with flame. His island fortress, once an emblem of Japan's resolve, was reduced to fragments of coral and the echo of distant guns. Yet amid that ruin, Shibasaki still moved, calm as ever, stepping from bunker to bunker through smoke and sand, carrying with him the last thread of order. He wore his dress uniform, as he always did, in battle: white gloves, a samurai's sword, and a face that betrayed neither fatigue nor fear. His staff begged him to remain underground, to conserve his command for the end. He refused. A commander, he told them, must be seen. His presence was the last defense stronger than concrete, the belief that Tarawa still had meaning. Under his direction, the remaining guns fired in perfect rhythm. Machine gunners shifted position every few minutes to avoid detection. Mortars fell in arcs that seemed almost deliberate despite the chaos. The Japanese line was no longer a line at all, but a constellation of embers, each burning in isolation, held together by faith in his voice. To the men who saw him stride through the wreckage, Shibasaki was no longer just an officer. He was the embodiment of Bushido itself, discipline incarnate beneath a storm. Shortly before noon, he stepped from a command post near the central pier, intent on reaching another battery to the west. The air was dense with the stench of fuel and the whine of incoming shells. One of them, a 14-inch round, fired from a distant battleship, landed close enough to lift the ground. Witnesses later said there was no sound after the blast, only the sudden absence of movement. Where Shibasaki had stood, there was nothing left to find. News of his death moved through the bunkers, not by radio, but by silence. Each man who learned of it said nothing. They simply fought harder. With their commander gone, the garrison no longer followed orders. They followed memory. Strategy dissolved into sacrifice. Each position became its own empire, each soldier its own command. They fought until their weapons melted, until grenades were the only language left. Above them, the American sky filled with aircraft. The Marines, now in control of the beachhead, called in airstrikes on every bunker that resisted. Hellcats and Dauntlesses dove through columns of smoke, releasing bombs that tore open what was left of the island's heart. The sound was continuous, deafening, unbroken. Tarawa had become a furnace, its coral glowing beneath the flames. By sunset, nothing living could be seen moving on the eastern ridge. Yet still, from beneath the debris, came the occasional single shot, the echo of men who refused to surrender even to extinction. For the Americans advancing through that ruin, victory no longer felt like triumph. It felt like intrusion, an unwanted entry into a place where conviction had already burned itself to completion. Leadership ends in flesh, belief continues in ashes, and in those ashes, the final lesson of Tarawa was still waiting to be learned. By the third night, Tarawa was no longer an island. It was an ember floating in the Pacific, a furnace suspended between exhaustion and extinction. The Marines who had survived the beachhead now occupied a strip of land barely 600 yards deep. Around them, the sea hissed where hot metal met the tide. The smell of smoke and decay clung to the air, sweet and bitter at once. They had come to conquer. Now they were simply holding on. The sun had set behind a veil of soot. The horizon glowed faintly red, a permanent sunset that never darkened. In that half-light, the Americans dug in. They scraped shallow foxholes out of coral, arranged captured Japanese rifles in piles beside their own, and waited. Orders passed quietly from man to man. Conserve ammunition, stay low, no lights. Out to sea, the Navy's guns had fallen silent. For the first time since the invasion began, There would be no bombardment. The night would belong to those still breathing. They did not have to wait long. Shortly after midnight, the first sound came. Faint, metallic, deliberate. Then a bugle, its notes carried across the smoke like a voice from another age. Within seconds, the darkness erupted. Japanese soldiers poured from their tunnels and trenches, shouting, charging, firing from the hip. Some carried swords, others bayonets fixed to rifles, all driven by the conviction that the Emperor's gaze reached even here. They came in waves, each one breaking against the Marines' perimeter and dissolving into the earth. What followed was not battle in any organized sense. It was proximity, the kind of fighting where faces appear and vanish in the same heartbeat. Grenades arced through the dark, their fuses glowing briefly before they disappeared into chaos. Men stabbed with bayonets, swung entrenching tools, fired point-blank into shadows that were already too close to miss. The flashes of gunfire illuminated the scene in fragments, hands grasping, silhouettes falling, the glint of metal vanishing into the dirt. Flamethrower teams moved in where the charges had come from, their tanks sloshing as they advanced. The Marines no longer fired into the dark, they burned it. Flames erupted from the nozzles in long liquid arcs, crawling across the ground, seeping into bunkers, licking over the walls of shattered shelters. The night turned orange, the air filled with the roar of fire feeding on everything it touched. Coral, wood, and flesh alike. Still, the bugles sounded. Some Japanese soldiers ran straight into the flames, their uniforms igniting before they reached the lines. Others crawled through smoke to throw grenades, to die closer. The Marines answered with gunfire until barrels glowed red. Somewhere in the chaos, the two armies became indistinguishable, men reduced to movement, to survival, to the most primal expression of war. When dawn finally came, it revealed a landscape that no longer resembled the earth. The sand had turned black. The palm trees were gone, reduced to stumps that smoked in the breeze. The bodies of the fallen lay intertwined in the trenches. Japanese and American, enemy and friend, burned into the same color. The Marines who stood that morning did not cheer. There was no victory here, only the stillness that follows, when everything living has spent itself. They cleaned their weapons, drank water that tasted of ash, and prepared for the next attack that might never come. The fire that had once divided them, theirs and the enemy's, now seemed to belong to neither side. The fire no longer chose sides, and before the next sunset, even the victors would feel its cost. When the sun rose over Betio on November 23, 1943, the Pacific seemed almost calm again. The sky was a perfect, indifferent blue. The tide rolled in gently, erasing the footprints of the dead. To an observer on a distant ship, it might have looked like any other island, a ribbon of coral glowing softly beneath morning light. But to those who had survived the last 76 hours, Tarawa was no longer a place. It was a wound. The Marines advanced in silence, their boots crunched over coral dust and bone, over fragments of helmets and melted rifles. The air was heavy with the smell of burnt oil and flesh, a smell that clung to everything it touched. The noise of war had gone, replaced by the hum of flies. Every sound felt intrusive. Even speech came softly, as though the island itself demanded silence. They moved bunker by bunker, clearing what the night's fire had missed. Some positions still burned, others smoked faintly from deep underground. Inside, they found what the bombardment and the flamethrowers had left behind. The silhouettes of men, frozen where they had fallen, their weapons fused to their hands. Many had died by their own grenades, lying beside their comrades in postures of ritual stillness. The defenders had fought to the last, as their code demanded, and where defeat was certain, they had denied the conqueror the act of capture. In one bunker near the pier, a group of wounded Japanese still lived. They refused treatment, refused water, refused words. When the Marines approached, one reached for his pistol, another pulled the pin of a grenade. The explosion was small, almost delicate, but its echo lingered through the ruins. The Americans learned again what they already knew. There would be no surrender on Tarawa. By noon, the battle was declared over. A report moved through the command channels, spare and unembellished. Japanese garrison destroyed, 4,690 dead, 17 prisoners. The numbers were precise, the arithmetic of annihilation complete. Yet when the message reached the fleet, it did not sound like triumph. On the beaches below, the cost lay in rows. 1,500 Americans killed or wounded, their bodies laid side by side in the sand they had died to claim. The men who remained upright did not celebrate. They wandered through the wreckage like archaeologists of their own suffering, searching for friends who would not answer, checking names against the silence. Victory, when it came, was hollow, a shape without substance. The island had been taken, but no one felt ownership. Even the flag, when it was raised over Betio, seemed to hang in still air, limp against the sky. In the distance, naval guns fired a final salute. It was not ceremony, but cleansing, a ritual to mark the end of the noise. The smoke drifted westward, toward the next island, toward the next campaign. For most of the men here, Tarawa would be remembered not for its triumph, but for what it revealed, that fire wins wars, but never peace. As evening fell, the ocean turned the color of iron. The Marines gathered on the shore, watching the sea carry their dead away. The battle was finished, but the silence that followed was not relief. It was reckoning, the realization that the machine of war, once set in motion, consumed everything, including the men who fed it. Fire wins wars, but not peace, and beyond the horizon, new islands waited, still untouched by flame. In Washington, winter had already settled over the Potomac when the first reports from Tarawa arrived. The documents were clinical, numbers, tonnage, casualty lists, and grid coordinates. But between the lines ran something new, an unease, a recognition that modern war had entered a different age. What was meant to be a textbook invasion had instead become a crucible. Every assumption, every calculation of tide, timing, and morale had been tested and found wanting. At the Navy Department, officers read the after-action summaries in silence. The phrases were stark: unexpected reef, heavy casualties, enemy resistance underestimated. Yet beneath the failures was something else: adaptation. Out of the blood and confusion, a new doctrine was taking shape. Amphibious warfare, once theory on paper, had become a science written in men's lives. By December, entire manuals were being rewritten. Landing craft would be redesigned with higher clearance. Intelligence units would begin mapping tides and coral formations across the Pacific. The lessons had been bought dearly, but they would not be ignored. The same pragmatism hardened at sea. Commanders who once relied on mass bombardment now demanded precision. Fire coordination between ships and infantry would be direct, instantaneous, guided by spotters on the ground rather than assumptions from afar. Engineers requested more flamethrowers, more demolition charges, more amphibious armor. What had once been viewed as barbaric was now considered essential. The old boundaries between courage and cruelty had been erased by necessity. In the offices of the Marine Corps, casualty photographs began to circulate, not for propaganda, but for instruction. Men were shown where tactics had failed, how geography had conspired with faith to make an island into a fortress. It was not sentiment but education. Tarawa had taught them that survival was not granted by technology alone. but by the capacity to learn under fire. When the pictures reached the public, the effect was different. Newspapers carried images of Marines lying face down in shallow surf, rifles still clutched in their hands. The reaction was shock, then anger. Americans had been told the war was progressing toward victory, not that victory could look like this. For the first time, the home front saw what securing an island truly meant. Officials called it necessary sacrifice. The phrase did little to comfort the mothers who could identify their sons in the photographs. Yet even within that grief, there was resolve. Across the Pacific, new campaigns were already being planned. Kwajalein, Saipan, Peleliu. Each one a direct descendant of Tarawa, shaped by its failures, armed with its grim knowledge. The island had become a classroom of death, and the war would now proceed as lesson upon lesson, each more efficient, each more merciless. On the other side of the ocean, Japanese planners drew their own conclusions. They studied the reports captured from the Americans, noting how quickly their enemy adapted. The imperial staff understood the implication. What had been burned once would be burned again. The war had entered a phase without mercy. The Pacific, from the Marshalls to Okinawa, would be consumed island by island until nothing untouched remained. In the end, Tarawa's meaning could not be confined to a single battle. It was a revelation that belief, industry, and courage, when combined, could achieve victory, but that each came at a cost none could fully measure. The island was conquered, yes, but its true conquest was intellectual, not territorial. Tarawa had forced the modern world to stare into the mirror of its own progress and see not glory, but fire. Each lesson written in ash demands another to read it, and far beyond the horizon, both nations were already turning the page. In the months after Tarawa, the Pacific no longer seemed vast enough to contain what had begun there. The lessons of that small coral island, earned in 76 hours of fire, were carried outward like embers on the wind. They reached the shipyards of California, the planning rooms of Pearl Harbor, the minds of officers who had seen what modern war required and what it consumed. From those embers, America forged a new weapon, method. At Kwajalein, the method proved itself. The invasion came in February 1944, calculated, synchronized, and relentless. This time the reefs were charted, the tides understood, the bombardments prolonged. Thousands of shells fell in perfect sequence, turning the atoll into dust before the first Marines stepped ashore. What Tarawa had exposed, Kwajalein corrected, and yet, beneath the precision, the same truth remained. The sea still turned red. By summer, the war machine moved on to Saipan. Here, Japan's defense had changed. The soldiers no longer built bunkers in coral. They dug tunnels into mountains. They no longer waited for annihilation. They planned to drag it with them. Caves were linked in miles of underground labyrinths, invisible from the air, impervious to bombardment. The Americans answered with more fire, more coordination, more speed. Air, land, and sea merged into one continuous assault. Villages vanished beneath naval shells. Forests ignited from above, and the line between military and civilian dissolved entirely. Peleliu followed in September, a battle few remember, but none who fought could forget. The island's limestone ridges and hidden caverns turned days into months. Each hill, each tunnel was another Tarawa, compressed, intensified, repeated. The Marines advanced yard by yard, their flamethrowers lighting the darkness like torches in a mine. Japan's defenders no longer hoped to win. They fought to delay, to teach their enemy that every step forward would be through fire. The Japanese army, too, was learning. At Tarawa, faith had been static. an acceptance of death in place. By 1944, it became movement, transformation. Soldiers hid beneath the earth by day and struck by night. Engineers carved caves capable of withstanding direct hits from battleships. And when resistance collapsed, men turned themselves into weapons. The word suicide entered military vocabulary, not as tragedy, but as doctrine. The wall of fire that once defined a single battle now spanned an ocean. From coral to jungle, from atoll to volcanic slope, the rhythm was the same: bombardment, assault, extinction. Each island was both target and rehearsal for the next. Each victory, another refinement of annihilation. For the Americans, it was progress, measured in shorter campaigns, fewer mistakes, more predictable destruction. For the Japanese, it was revelation. The enemy had learned too well. But beneath every improvement lay a deepening shadow. Civilians now lived where soldiers fought. On Saipan, families leapt from cliffs rather than surrender. In the Philippines, entire towns vanished beneath artillery meant for garrisons. The machinery that had begun as liberation had become impersonal, efficient, unstoppable, and blind. Tarawa had been the experiment. The Pacific War was now the result. Across thousands of miles, the same formula unfolded: overwhelming power against immovable faith, each feeding the other's certainty. The Americans called it strategy. The Japanese called it destiny. In truth, it was both. And neither. Victory evolves. So does horror. And far ahead, on an island still unknown to most of the men fighting, that evolution would reach its final form. When the smoke finally cleared from Tarawa, Marines began to search through the ruins, not for enemies, but for evidence of what the battle had meant. Among the ash and coral, they found diaries sealed in tin boxes, notebooks wrapped in oilcloth, fragments of words preserved beneath layers of soot. The handwriting was delicate, precise, almost ceremonial. These were not the records of defeat. They were testimonies of faith. One entry, written the night before the invasion, read simply, "We are the walls of the Emperor. When the ocean rises, we do not move." Another, scrawled on the back of a ration wrapper after the bombardment, said, "The Americans burn the very air. The island itself is on fire. We are still here." The tone was not despair, but awe, the astonishment of men who had seen nature itself turned into a weapon. For the Japanese soldiers of Tarawa, death was not the opposite of victory. It was its completion. To fall in defense of the Emperor was not failure, but fulfillment. They had not misunderstood their orders. They had transcended them. Theirs was a war of spirit, waged in the conviction that will could survive even when the body could not. When the flames swept through their bunkers, many died kneeling, hands folded, their final thoughts not of defeat, but of arrival. For the Americans who survived, the lesson was different. They had come to the island armed with every product of modern science, the precision of artillery, the logic of planning, the rhythm of the machine. But in those 76 hours, technology had become secondary. What had carried them forward through the reef, through the fire, through the smoke, was not confidence in their weapons, but in each other. In the Pacific, survival itself had become a kind of faith, stripped of glory, stripped of doctrine, but no less absolute. The diaries revealed two sides of a single transformation. For Japan, faith had hardened into fatalism. For America, faith had shifted from destiny to endurance. Between them stood the wall of fire, a weapon that consumed not only soldiers and sand, but ideals. What had begun as a contest of nations had become something elemental, conviction against combustion, belief tested in its purest form. When historians later read those Japanese journals, many noted how rarely the word enemy appeared. The Americans were described not with hatred, but with fascination, as if they were forces of nature rather than men. "They burn the sea," one wrote. "They make the thunder obey." It was not surrender, it was reverence, the recognition of a power that could no longer be met with courage alone. The Americans, in turn, read those words with quiet discomfort. They saw themselves reflected not as liberators, but as instruments of an industrial age that had learned to manufacture apocalypse. The wall of fire had begun as a tactic, but at Tarawa it had become a symbol of progress without restraint, of faith transformed into fuel. In the end, both sides had lost something sacred. The Japanese lost the illusion that spirit alone could resist the modern world. The Americans lost the belief that reason and industry could remain untouched by the horrors they created. Between them, the Pacific burned, a mirror held up to humanity's twin convictions, that belief can conquer all, and that fire can purify anything. The strongest weapon in war is belief, until it meets fire. And on the horizon, a new kind of fire was already waiting, brighter than any the world had yet seen. Today, the island of Betio lies quiet beneath the Pacific sun. The sea laps gently against the reef where thousands once fell, its surface calm, its silence deceiving. From the air, it looks unchanged, a small crescent of coral, 3 miles long, half a mile wide. But on the ground, the scars remain. The sand is darker here. Beneath it, fragments of iron still sleep, and at low tide, the surf reveals them. The twisted hulls of landing craft, the rusted skeletons of tanks meet the outlines of a war that refused to disappear. Locals walk past the wrecks without speaking. Time has softened the edges, but not the meaning. Betio is both grave and classroom, a place where progress learned its price. The coral still bears the marks of fire, fused and blackened like glass. In some places, it gleams under sunlight, a mirror to the past. Every year, a few survivors return. They are old now, men in their late 90s, carried across oceans to stand again where they were once young. They do not speak of glory. They speak of the smell, burnt salt and steel, the taste of smoke that never left their throats. They speak of the moment the ocean turned red and the sky disappeared into flame. Some bring handfuls of sand home in jars, others kneel quietly and leave them there. For them, Tarawa was not just a battle, it was the moment when innocence, theirs and their nation's, ended. Historians have written volumes about those 76 hours. They call Tarawa the crucible, the turning point in the Pacific, the place where America learned what total war demanded. It was there that technology and belief collided so completely that neither emerged unchanged. The United States left Tarawa armed with a doctrine that would carry it across the Pacific and eventually into the atomic age. The wall of fire that began here would soon circle the planet. Japan remembers it differently. In their records, Tarawa is not a defeat, but a revelation, the moment faith met fire and found its limits. It stands as proof that courage, even perfect courage, cannot withstand the chemistry of modern war. Yet it also endures as testament that spirit can face annihilation and still refuse surrender. Both nations found truth here, and both buried it under progress. Today, the world remembers Tarawa as history. Students read its statistics, historians measure its lessons. But those lessons were written not in ink, but in ash. The beach that once defined a generation has become a symbol of courage without comprehension, of innovation without restraint. The island is smaller now, eroded by the tide and the weight of memory, but the question it poses remains vast. If fire can end one war, can it ever end the idea of war itself? The answer drifts somewhere in the silence between waves. in the wrecks still visible through clear water, in the faint metallic taste that lingers on the wind. The wall of fire, born here 80 years ago, has long since moved beyond these shores. It burns now in history, in memory, in the human capacity to build what it cannot control. They thought the wall of fire would end the war. It only began a new kind of one,